Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Yale ISM's Africana Sacred Healing Arts Conference. I'm Evan Graves. I'm Program Manager here at the ISM, and I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Martin Jean, who is Director of the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and Professor in Oregon here. So he's going to give a short welcome to get us started.
Thanks, Evan. Very welcome to all of you. You do us a great honor by being present here today. Many of you have traveled distance to join this conference. You've labored extensively on your preparations. You've left family, friends, home, work to gather here, and you've braved another increasingly hazardous health environment to do so. Thank you, and I pray that this time together will be a fruitful one for you, and I know that your participation in these deliberations will enrich them all the more. The Institute of Sacred Music is an interdisciplinary graduate center here at Yale. We're a community of about 120 faculty, staff, students, research fellows, and we all work together around the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. Historically, we were founded almost 50 years ago now to train clergy and church musicians, but our founding benefactors had an even larger vision in mind when gifting Yale with this institute. Indeed, their intent was to make a place in a great research university where any of the world's sacred arts, so-called, and ritual practices could be considered, practiced, studied, celebrated, and shared. We attempt to attend here to the sonic, the literary, the visual and material, the ritual, the gestural, both the built and natural environments, and indeed any culture, any religious practice, any material of any form. The lives and practices of African diasporic, African American, and other Africana communities have long been underrepresented in the academy and for decades woefully disregarded in this very institute. This conference series is one of a number of attempts to make a significant, long-lasting, though humble, course correction in a better direction. When we began to plan this series, now almost 2 years ago it seems, news of COVID vaccines seemed hopeful, and so the choice of healing as a theme seemed a rich and obvious one for our first installment. But that was then. This is now. The number of Black COVID deaths continue to grow disproportionately, surely in the millions by now. I searched around to find that statistic, and even that was elusive. Add to this all other manner of inequities of access to resources, work, healthcare, positions of influence, and one wonders if it is too soon to talk about healing. Standing before you here, on the one hand, and yet with one eye turned toward Buffalo, I have both a sense of despair and anger that yet more racial violence such as this can still exist. And yet, at the same time, as I look at you, hope that new words about new patterns of resistance will rise up in this gathering this week and set our face toward the rising sun and a new and better day. Permit me to close with an invitation, namely that as this conference proceeds, knowing it is only the first room, so to say, in an ongoing space we hope to maintain here, Should you have ideas for how such a gathering with such a mission as this might proceed in the future? And should you think we are worthy of your insights, I hope you will share them either in our conversations here or in communications that will surely follow. Thank you again for being here, and welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Bernard Gordillo, and I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and the chair of this session entitled Art, Healing, and Slavery. Our first presenter, Dr. Anna Arabindan-Kesson, is an assistant professor of Black diasporic art with a joint appointment in the departments of African American Studies and Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. Born in Sri Lanka, she completed undergraduate degrees in New Zealand and Australia and worked as a registered nurse before completing her PhD in African American Studies and Art History at Yale University. She focuses on African American, Caribbean, and British art with an emphasis on histories of race, empire, medicine, and transatlantic visual culture in the long 19th century. Her first book, published with Duke University Press, is called Black Bodies, White Gold, Art, Cotton, and Commerce in the Atlantic World. And she is also the director of the digital humanities project ArtHX, Visual and Medical Legacies of British Colonialism. She is at work on a second book called An Empire State of Mind, Plantation Imaginaries and British Colonialism. The title of her paper today is Bush Tea and Archived Bodies, Plantation Returns as Forms of Healing.
Thank you for that generous introduction. So in a recent conversation with artist Annalee Davis, who lives on this former sugar plantation in Barbados, the British Empire's first sugar island, she explained to me that everywhere in Barbados you see the plantation. Not only does Annalee physically inhabit this space, she describes how in her daily walks, the plantation's remains, pot shards, for example, continue to assert themselves in the present. And just as the plantation landscape is everywhere, its history on the island now takes on new futures through the tourist industry and its organization of local space. While the plantation is most often associated with the Americas as a New World institution, to quote art historian Catherine Manthorne, it's also a site that connected the British Empire across the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. Growing up in Australia and Sri Lanka, the plantation has always been part of the landscape, but its histories, and these are just examples of plantations that kind of have loomed large in my life and are very close to my home in Australia and Sri Lanka, its histories remain fairly elided. Inspired by Black feminist scholars and writers like Hazel Carby and Jamaica Kincaid, this project is really an attempt for me to understand how, again in the words of Annalee, how the plantation mediates my own interaction with space. In Australia, for instance, from the 1830s, capital from the East India Company and Caribbean sugar plantations aided the development of the country's agricultural system, both through the pastoral system, which was a form of land management that relied on the clearance and enforced labor of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Capital and former plantation owners from the US South were also crucial to the development of sugar plantations in Queensland in the tropical Northwest. And here too, former slave ships were reused in the enslavement of South Sea Islander people, kidnapped or deceived into traveling from the Pacific Islands to work these plantations. For contemporary artist Jasmine Togo Brisby, who was also descended from unfree South Sea Islander laborers, the plantation overlays her familial stories. And like Annalee, she too speaks of the contradictions embedded in its visibility, a space that everyone knows, yet whose histories remain obstructed. Now, although these artists work in very different parts of the world, they're demonstrating a turn, or perhaps a return to the plantation that they describe as a practice of repair. In working with the plantation's different registers of visibility, both Annalee and Jasmine position their practice in dialogue with its colonial imaginings, both as a form of landscape organization and as a form of representation. So for someone like me who is frequently working with the colonial archive, these artists offer really important methodologies for negotiating the challenge of looking at these historical archives without necessarily looking with them. They work with this a productive tension between official archives and personal narratives. While the plantation is a site of rupture, by returning to it, they seek out and articulate forms of repair that are not so much about reversal, but about encouraging a more relational tendency to place, to history, to what comes next. Becoming aware of your visual orientation from where you look becomes a ground from which to begin this process. And so following their attention to how things come into view, I want to move between the historical and the contemporary in this paper. And I'll begin with a brief description of how the plantation emerges in colonial imagery as a medicalized space. And then from there, I'll return to the work of these women to describe how their reparative work reorientates this historical viewpoint as the grounds for healing. I think of the plantation really as a physical manifestation of the colonial enterprise and its logic of possession, as we see here in Richard Lygon's map. Sustaining the British Empire and Britain more specifically, the transformation of the Caribbean from these smaller holdings into the large-scale industrial complex that Benjamin Haynes surveys in this map took place through genocidal clearance of indigenous communities and local ecology. And these same techniques of land management are transported to other parts of the British Empire. The plantation was a mobile form of enclosure. The emphasis on clearance as a process of land management is also reinforced by its visual representation. Most often, it's depicted through the genre of the picturesque, which was a very adaptable form of landscape representation that could modify local geographies into something recognizable, right, to a metropolitan audience in Britain. As a theory of landscape representation, the picturesque is ultimately concerned with improvement through modification of the real and with the synthesis of disparate elements into a pleasing whole. It established a perspective that emphasized immediacy, spontaneity, and most importantly, oversight. And in this way, it connects the plantations of the Caribbean to a wider network of landscape representation in the British Empire that orientated viewers to ecologies of space and people as manageable resources. So both the plantation and the aesthetic theories of the picturesque, with their emphasis on clearance and seeing clearly, were also important to discourses of medical topography in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Medical topographies essentially mapped what was thought to be diseased environments across the British Empire. And in this context, and particularly in the tropics of the Caribbean and South Asia, where disease was mapped onto space, plantations, because of their physical organization, offered the illusion of a land cleared of threatening disease, while also providing the space to study climatic and environmental causes of disease. While some parts of Australia were also described in this language as a kind of antidote to the more dangerous tropical areas of the empire, ideas about climate, health, and race gleaned from the medical topographies around the Caribbean and South Asia really directly influenced to this practice of kidnapping South Sea Islander communities in Queensland who were understood to be better suited, right, to labouring in the tropics than white Australians. So there's a kind of another direct connection. So along with these medical topographies, the plantation was also a site of medical surveillance. From bioprospecting to experimentation, the plantation's organization made possible sightlines of observation and control that facilitated the close examination and scrutiny of non-human and human life. I've not yet found evidence of these experimentations in plantations in Australia, And I've skipped through those images fairly quickly because they are quite traumatic to look at. But I think it's important to remember the lives of the men and women who were victimized in these spaces. While I've not yet found evidence of these experimentations in Australia, in terms of the plantation, medical examination was a prevalent and punitive form of surveillance over unfree plantation workers, both Indigenous communities and South Sea Islander communities, both in terms of disease prevention and ascertaining their fitness for labour. So these forms of medical surveillance relied on this visual acuity and the management that's encoded in a plantation's physical organisation. But they also required moving closer, they required doctors, the plantation owners, artists to zoom in, as it were, taking on a microscopic view of life on the plantation in order to literally make its human and non-human life legible. So we see this attempt, I think, to move between the micro and the macro in this print, which was made for a doctor called John A. Waller during his travels through the Caribbean. It shows here, this is a view that Waller describes of an enslaved community on a Barbados plantation. And you'll notice that we have to toggle here between the close-up, like the details of plantation life, and then the expanded oversight of the plantation as a whole, which is really sort of registered through the plantation house, kind of at the top of the hill. And these different viewpoints are offered as sort of empirical sites to reveal different aspects of plantation life. So while we're able to observe and take on multiple viewing positions at once, you'll notice in Waller's unique sectioning of the enslaved quarters, he creates a sort of relief-like view of the interior of this small house, along with the sort of awkward positioning of the figures in profile at the foreground. I think this sort of disjuncture reflects something of the paradoxical relationship, right, embedded in these medical and aesthetic attempts to bring things into view, yet keep them at a distance. Waller's print, taking us onto the ground, brings us also into a closer proximity with other kinds of life on the plantation, taking us perhaps into what Sylvia Winter has called the plot, those parcels of land on which enslaved people could grow their own food and feed themselves, thereby minimizing a planter's costs. The plot, in Winter's terms, might signify a site of subsistence where plants and knowledge could grow, could be used and shared. We might consider here, for example, in the Waller print, the emphasis that he seems to put on what might be ceramic ware and what could be material traces of practices of nourishment and healing, forms of community creation and activation that existed within but also beyond the extractive regimes of the plantation. In practical terms, the plot might have been the ground on which enslaved healers learnt about cures of the local flora. Perhaps they grew their own and taught each other. Emerging from this extractive logic of the plantation, the plot nevertheless existed outside it, a space where transplanted enslaved people could nurture and cultivate cosmologies through subsistence. The plot also suggests forms of reciprocity and an orientation towards space that can move us away from the transactional relations of the plantation and its promise of return. These plot histories and their reciprocity, particularly the reciprocity they evoke between human and non-human life, also animate Annalee's work. In returning to the plantation, she takes on these medicalized histories, but rather than starting from this position of oversight, she begins from the soil. As I mentioned at the beginning, her practice really revolves around walking, which she does every morning at dawn. And as she walks, she describes how she notices plants, often described as weeds, reasserting themselves against the backdrop of the sugar industry. And in this series, Wild Plant Series, Annalee uses 1970s ledger paper, which she found on the farm that she lives on, which you can see. And this becomes the ground, like literally on which these images of wild plants take form. In studying the plants, she began to understand their value in creating biodiversity on the land, along with their historic use for bush teas, baths, and medicine. The ledger paper is, of course, a graphic reminder of the economic value and commodification of the land and the people who were forced to work on it. However, the process of collecting, pressing, and drawing these plants onto the paper literally materializes another terrain in which the plantation comes into view as something like an apothecary, where the cultivation of land was a form of nourishment and reciprocity that hinged on practices of care, community, and healing. So the way that Annalee describes these plants are as healing agents. She draws on the concept of phytoremediation, which is the process by which certain plants are able to detoxify water and land, and uses these histories to also address the agricultural and social degradation created by the plantation economy. So in this work, Bush Tea Plot, she created a glass planter that allowed viewers to see the soil profile of a specially curated plot where plants with medicinal properties were grown. And this now it remains outside the National Museum in Barbados. And she also provided, as you can see, she also provided viewers with this digital tool so they could learn more information about the soil and the plants. Connected to this series was another one called Bush Tea Services, which repurposed those shards of pottery that she also finds when she goes out walking in the mornings into a tea set, which you can see down the bottom here. And in this tea set, she served sweetened bush tea, with reference to the sugarcane, brewed from the plants that she harvested from these former plantations. Honoring the women and men who planted, used, and cared for each other with these medicines, this piece literally returns us to the soil itself, refiguring the grounds of the plantation from a space of controlled oversight into a site for restoration and embodied knowledge that begins from the ground up. Working on this visual scale, right, that's moving from a perspective of looking over to being sort of embedded in the land itself, Annalee's working to create the grounds from which to imagine different modes of care for each other and the land. But she describes how these modes really emerge from these plantation histories, but are unable to be contained by them. For Annalee, a practice of healing is space-making. It is sustainable and future-looking. It is, to quote Glissant, relational. Through her practice, she encourages audiences to cultivate new relationships with the soil that can also, that for her, work to restore her local community's physical relationship to the land, helping people to see it more as a site, helping people to see it as more than a site of violence and of shame. And this is something that's very important to her practice, and she talks about a lot as a kind of activist practice. Through her practice, she also supports the cultivation of new relationships to agricultural labor and food justice initiatives, while expanding access to the natural world as a space of recreation and repair in the face of an ever-expanding tourism industry. The relationality of Davis' work, I think, also helps us to see the historical plantation as a relational site that came into view through these different forms of production, medical, economic, and artistic, a place where multiple knowledge systems intersect, and a place where human and non-human life was entangled. It was also a space that connected different parts of the globe, and it's really this sense of connection that is really central to the practice of Jasmine Toga Brisby, who also continues to work to bring what is hidden from view into public memory. And as she describes, it's really the work of artists in the Caribbean and the US, particularly artists like Kara Walker, whose return to the plantation gave Jasmine a framework and a language with which to articulate her family's experience of enslavement in the Pacific. It also, as she describes it, the work of artists like Kara, like Annalee, also helped her create a framework to understand how the plantation industry of Australia was a direct and long-term effect of the transatlantic slavery in the Atlantic world, which remains a very contentious view in Australia. So Jasmine's practice expands from this distinction between the erasure of personal histories and the plantation's public visibility. The history of Australian South Sea Islanders' enslavement was not only sidelined in Australian history, it was doubly negated by the government's deportation of these labourers back to the Pacific Islands after the passage of the White Australia policy in the early 20th century. They were only officially recognised by the government as a unique minority group in 1994. And so this sculpture, Bittersweet, deals precisely with this history of erasure. We see here a pile of skulls cast in unrefined sugar and resin that glisten under the gallery lights, slowly giving off a sickly sweet smell. The work was prompted by the discovery of an unmarked mass grave on a former plantation in Queensland. The grave for Jasmine is a profound metaphor for the literal silencing of this history in the public sphere. It's also a metaphor for the loss experienced by Australian South Sea Islander communities whose culture and language were stolen when they were kidnapped and brought across the sea. So here in Bittersweet, Jasmine invites us all to mourn these lives while powerfully materializing the profound oppression, dislocation, and familial trauma passed down through generations. Like Annalee, she's also using her artwork as a form of witness to activate familial memories that can destabilize the official record, while also creating a language to articulate what has been lost. We can't move into the future without knowing our past, Jasmine says. And here in another series called The Past is Ahead, Don't Look Back, she uses a collodion process to emulate these 19th century archival practices that allow her literally to step into that archive. And in this active animation, she produces a space of coexistence where she can stand with her ancestors, the ones she has lost. These women's practices are restorative in the deepest sense. By cultivating spaces of relational encounter, they transform us from observer to something like a witness, an orientation or tending toward blackness, to quote Huey Copeland, that has reframed the ways I too can look at colonial images and approach colonial archives. Working and walking between the official record and memory, they activate archives and animate the landscape in ways that direct our attention to historical and communal practices of healing, survival, survivance, and repair that continue to reassert themselves in the present. Across disparate geographies, they call up another plantation imagery and another plantation imaginary that offers different modes of relation to space, to history, to community, as their grounds on which to forge new solidarities and envision new futures together. Thank you.
Our second presenter, Stephen Hamilton, is a mixed media artist, researcher, and arts educator living and working in Boston, Massachusetts. He is currently a first-year PhD student in Harvard's African and African American Studies department. His research focuses on the indigenous textile industries of southern Nigeria. He has been an exhibiting artist for the past 10 years. These include solo and collaborative exhibitions in Boston at the Medicine Wheel Spoke Gallery in 2020 and the Museum of the National Center for African American Artists in 2016. He has worked on temporary, site-specific, large-scale, mixed-media, textile, and sculpture installations for the past 4 years. These include the Founders Project, previously located at the Bruce C. Bowling Building in Boston from 2018 to 2019, and Stitched into Memory, previously located at Atlantic Wharf, also in Boston in 2017. Hamilton has work in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston. The title of his presentation is Cloth, Medicine, and Material, examining the history of textile arts and sciences from ancient Africa to the Americas.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. As mentioned before, my paper is called Cloth, Medicine, and Material, examining the history of textile arts and sciences from ancient Africa to the Americas. I would like to state that this is part of a larger project that I'm working on, tracing the history of upright loom weaving in West Africa from the late Neolithic up until the transatlantic slave trade. What I aim to do in this paper is to think about the intersections between cloth, commerce, material culture, and medicine, and thinking about how all of these things impact the cultural experiences of Africans both on the continent and in the diaspora, but also thinking about textile arts as a technology affiliated with other technologies such as pharmacology, and also thinking about the ways in which all of these very complex histories intersect in terms of the Black experience from the past into the present. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to mention where my practice comes from. I'm an artist practitioner, so in addition to research, in addition to looking at the works of scholars, for example, for this paper, looking at works by Chris Ehret, Colleen Krieger, Jan Van Sina, Margaret Olugbemisola Areo. My work comes from my experiences as a traditional indigo dyer and as an upright loom weaver. Again, this work that I'm doing is indebted to the work of women who are very generous with their practice with me, learning at the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture between 2015 and 2016, learning from people like Chief Nikkei Okundaye Davies, and my teacher, Miss Agnes Umeche, who's pictured on the right, who is a master weaver from the town of Okene in Kogi State. Again, it is through the practice of creating that I'm able to, that facilitates my research. So in addition to reading, I'm also using these materials that I'm talking about in this paper as part of my praxis and experimenting with this information I'm learning through my artistic practice. And again, because I am an artist, the way in which I am framing this research is through the perspective of an artist. So this piece here, which is called, which is based off of a work by Sylvia Arden Boone, Radiance from the Waters. It is called Nyaha and Sowawui, The Perfection of All Which is Blackness. And it uses the materials that I'm covering in this paper, although there's thousands of fibers and dyes which are used were used in pre-colonial Africa that have made great impacts to the history of textile arts and sciences in Africa. My paper focuses on three materials: indigo, raffia, and cotton, which is used in this piece. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the physical properties of these materials, their history of use in Africa, and also how those uses transcend their physical use in textiles, and how they also have ritual and medicinal uses as well. Also thinking about how that impacts practices throughout the diaspora. So first I want to start with raffia, and the reason why I'm starting with raffia is because raffia is a fiber connected with some of the oldest textile traditions in Africa. The quote that you're seeing here was collected by Paula Gershik Ben Amos from a chief in Benin City, the Enogie of Ikemuyiri. And the quote, raffia leaves are the cloth of the ancestors, is a reference to raffia being associated with some of the earliest weaving traditions in West and West Central Africa. There are many different species of raffia, but raffia has many uses. Raffia is used to create palm wine, a beverage of important ritual and ceremonial importance throughout Africa. Raffia is used in construction. It's used to make mats. Their branches are used in the frameworks of buildings. They're used to make textiles. Medicines, fish poisons are collected from raffia. And again, according to early African scholars, raffia was integral to agriculture, architecture, and food production amongst early Africans. It's believed that textiles and other material culture using raffia may have been used by ancient Niger-Congo-speaking people as early as 6,000 years before present. So the images you're seeing here is an extraction of the raffia palm fiber by a Bamesang weaver in Cameroon, and the midrib of raffia, which is used in basketry, the pisava, which is used in basketry from this artisan in Nigeria, this Igbo artisan in Nigeria. In addition to the physical properties of raffia, raffia, has the benefit of being semi-waterproof. It has a lot of the attributes that you would connect with linen or rami or other types of bast fibers. Raffia has very specific ritual uses which are seen all throughout West and West Central Africa. So again, when we're thinking about raffia and its meanings translate throughout West and West Central Africa to many different groups. So the image that you're seeing here is of an Olokun shrine in the palace of Chief Ogiaman in Benin City, where raffia has specific ritual properties. It is a material associated with the demarcation of sacred spaces. It's associated with protection and purification. It's associated with the ability to protect and also to shield from damaging forces. The belief that raffia has these properties is translated to many different groups throughout West and West Central Africa where raffia is associated with purification. It's been documented amongst Bakongo-speaking peoples who are some of the largest producers of material culture using raffia. The raffia was also used for the same purpose, to protect against broken taboos and also to provide spaces of purification. You can see how raffia is being used at the doorway of this temple in Benin City, and also incorporated in the shrine in the house of Chief Ogiame in Benin City, where it has those same properties. Again, these traditions are seen all throughout Nigeria, into Gabon, into Cameroon, and into the Congo Basin. The ritual significance of raffia as associated with purification also enters the diaspora through the transatlantic slave trade. We see raffia and the costume of raffia associated with the worship of Babaluaye, the deity associated with protection and the spread of infectious diseases. Raffia in this context, or the African straw as it's used in the Afro-Brazilian context, is believed to protect and purify while also sweeping disease upon those who are upon the unjust. So in this image by Phyllis Galimbo, documenting her work, comparing the ritual traditions of Benin City and different locations in Brazil, show that relationship, which is also seen in this image by Pierre Verger, documenting the history of candomblé and the practice of candomblé in Brazil amongst Afro-Brazilian communities. We also see how raffia, again, which is associated with masquerade, associated with spiritual practices throughout Africa and the diaspora, are also used by contemporary artists. For example, in this image, cupboard number 8 by the amazing artist Simone Yvette Lee. This material culture cannot be removed from complex histories of commerce. Mary Hicks talks about very little, eminent scholar Mary Hicks talks about the very little, very narrowly explored relationships between textile industries in West Africa and in the Americas, where Afro-Brazilians are importing textiles made in West Africa, mostly textiles which are made by Nigerian women. The import of these textiles were very fundamental in establishing ideas of Afro-Brazilian identity, and they retained many of their ritual and commercial significances in Brazil as they did in Nigeria, functioning as a conduit between African communities on the continent and African communities in the diaspora. This raffia cloth, made out of raffia and indigo-dyed cotton, was made in Nigeria but collected in Bahia in the late 19th century. Again, raffia as symbolic of purification, as symbolic of the demarcation of sacred spaces, exists throughout West Africa, and it also exists in the performances, the ritual performances on the continent. So you can see in this image of the Agbo masquerade, the part of the Agbo masquerade in Ijebu Ode, which would have been close to where this raffia cloth was produced. It could have been produced in Ijebu, it could have been produced in Lagos. These weaving traditions are common all throughout southern Nigeria. This Okoro masquerader wears a costume, an elegant costume of tightly woven raffia, image courtesy of Henry Druhl. The performance of the Okoro as the first masquerader who exits the bush, who enters the city, also references this idea of purification and the threshold, raffia being associated with this demarcation of sacred space. That's reverberated by the fact that this is the first masquerade that enters the town. I just wanted to also talk about the ceremonial importance of raffia cloth as a ritual object associated with burial, associated with transitions in life. Raffia cloth is used throughout West and West Central Africa. A lot of the focus on raffia textiles tends to focus on Central Africa, but raffia is also used throughout West and West Central Africa. And we can see comparisons between these textiles made by this Bakusu weaver in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo and this Fon-speaking weaver in the Benin Republic. Both of these objects have ceremonial uses, in addition to being wrappers that could have been used for everyday use. Both of them have specific ritual uses in funerals. These are both cloths which can be associated with the burial of the dead. Again, showing how this raffia weaving tradition is widespread throughout West and West Central Africa. This is a weaver from Cameroon. This is a weaver from Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see the ways in which this loom technology also spreads with ancient populations deep in Africa's past, deep in Africa's history. Raffia cloth is also some of the most beautiful textiles like ever made. We can see in these textiles from Democratic Republic and Angola, this pende and this Congo textile. Again, the symbolism of these textiles referencing important elements in the cosmology of the region, thinking about the cycles between life, death, and rebirth, and also thinking about how these techniques and patterns, again, are widespread over a great space of time. These cut pile brocaded textiles we see in Nigeria, such as this cotton cut pile textile in the city of Owo, all the way into Democratic Republic of Congo. So again, there is a very ancient significance to these techniques and these materials. These examples of raffia cloths here. Cotton is a material which also has a very loaded history. The proverb that you're seeing here, plant cotton, do not plant beads, plant cotton, do not plant brass, beads and brass do not follow one to the grave. It is only cotton. It's only when one dies that cloth follows them. Cotton and its association with cloth and its ritual significance is seen wherever cotton is grown in Africa. It's important to understand that there are indigenous species of cotton in West Africa, specifically wild cotton, wild Gossypium herbaceum africanum, which is used as medicine even in places where weaving is not prominent. It has various uses. Cotton bark is used for gastrointestinal purposes. It's used mixed with other herbs to aid in lactation and to facilitate labor. And it is also used as an abortifacient, a practice which enslaved Africans brought with them to the Americas. What's important about cotton root and cotton and its use in regulating pregnancy and fertility can be seen in the ritual use of cotton cloth to facilitate fertility. Cotton is absorbent. It's associated with being able to absorb both positive and negative spiritual forces, which is why cotton cloth has such important ritual use. Cotton cloth woven by the Yoruba people on the upright loom called kijipa, certain specific rituals can be done to the cloth in order to aid and facilitate in pregnancy. So it's important to understand that cotton cloth has a ritual significance which is tied to its significance as a medicinal material. Again, thinking about this as an artist, my perspective as an artist frames these things. So this image that you see here is an image called Omo Obatala, he who kills the initiate and rouses them to new life. The praise name of Obatala is he who sleeps in white and awakens in white. Thinking about the power of white cloth and white cotton cloth as a ritual textile associated with the worship of deities throughout West and West Central Africa, especially associated with these powers associated with ritual purity. So again, thinking about this material as an artist and how I use the material, weaving the cotton cloth also relates to the research which I'm doing. Again, The history of cotton in the Americas is very complex. Cotton was associated with one of the largest industries, not only in the Americas, but in Africa. It's important to understand that massive amounts of cotton textiles were produced by African men and women for exchange with each other, but also as part of this transatlantic trade. The areas in which many enslaved people were coming from, were being brought from, were areas that were very important for local cotton production. The areas in southern Nigeria of Igbo, Yoruba, and Edo-speaking people, as well as the Senegambia and the Windward Coast, were all major cotton-producing regions, important to the local textile industries. When we're thinking about the enslavement of African people, it's important to understand that as an enslavement of African knowledge and industry and production, capturing knowledge that Africans have, capturing methods of productions that African had, and exploiting them to facilitate exploitive white supremacist colonial economies. So we see these images of these formerly enslaved women in this cotton plantation. It's also important to understand that while they're being captured and forced to use to facilitate this exploitive cotton industry, Black women are using cotton root in order to regulate their own fertility and take control of their own bodies. Thinking about the ways in which Black women and fertility of Black women is captured to reproduce slavery, their use of cotton bark, their use of this African indigenous knowledge in order to take control of their own bodies is incredibly important, and also tied to the relationship that African women have with cotton as a source of regulating fertility, as a source of denoting class, denoting power and title and status. So as you can see in the images of these beautifully woven cotton cloths. But also the relationship that women have as cotton cultivators and spinners throughout Africa. This image is a Yoruba woman from Ishin, an Igbo woman from the Nsukka area, and even in Angola and Democratic Republic of Congo, again, areas where enslaved people were brought, massive amounts of enslaved people were brought. We see cotton being gathered, wild cotton being gathered and used in textiles and in medicine, such as in this image of this woman, most likely Chokwe from the Southern Democratic Republic of Congo. This last image, the last part that I want to talk about is indigo, which is an incredibly important substance throughout West and West Central Africa. The proverb that you're seeing here is from Ejogbe. It's a verse, and Agbe was instructed to dip its feathers in the indigo dye. This indigo has many uses in West and West Central Africa. It facilitated this massive production of cotton textiles because it was a dye used to produce these cotton textiles, these beautiful indigo textiles that were in such demand, not only on the African continent, but also overseas. These textiles were also exported to Brazil, to Afro-Brazilian communities. And indigo is important because it is a ritually charged substance. Those who work with indigo are working with a ritually charged substance, and thus, because they are working with this ritually charged substance, they have themselves certain spiritual attributes which are attached to them. In the areas where our ancestors in the diaspora come from, indigo is the provenance of powerful women. Amongst groups in the Windward Coast and the Senegambia, as well as southern Nigeria, indigo is a provenance of female dyers. The process of reducing indigo is a very difficult process, requiring the reduction of indigo in alkaline solutions, and is subject to unexpected failure. So the ability to work with indigo is very much tied to the ability to work with this spiritually charged substance in order to ensure the success of an indigo pot. Cloths which are dyed black with indigo are associated with title and status, but they also are associated with facilitating fertility, which is why marriage cloths in many parts of West Africa, specifically Yoruba land, are dyed indigo black. Again, indigo is a ritually charged substance. It has the power to regulate this fertility, but it also has the power to be destructive. Indigo dyers are associated with the very ambivalent forces of the Awon Yawa, the divine mothers, who can bless or curse, who are the true owners of the earth, which is the name of this painting here, executed on indigo cloth. We can see the image of the iconic indigo dyers with their blue hands, again working with indigo as a ritually charged substance. These are images of indigo dyers, including my teacher, Miss Agnes, in Nigeria. Again, indigo's importance as a ritually charged substance, one with powers associated with the spiritual realm, is used by formerly enslaved and formerly enslaved people in the Americas, in South Carolina and in the Gullah Coast. We see the capture of African knowledge and labor being used to facilitate indigo industries, but also Africans still using indigo for their own practices of protection and healing, such as the practice of using indigo on doorways, on windowsills in order to protect households. Again, indigo, as a ritually charged substance, it has the power to be destructive or creative, also can be subverted in order to protect. And while these practices of using indigo in this specific way are more common in areas in the Windward Coast and the Senegambia, we can see again the use of indigo as a ritually charged substance being reclaimed by Africans, both enslaved and free. As we can see in this example of Rada Blank at the Met Gala, paying homage to these root women, these conjure women, these ritual specialists, by showing her hands dyed with the indigo blue, as showing her ability to capture the spiritually charged essence of indigo. Again, images of enslaved people in South Carolina. Again, capturing knowledge and capturing labor from Africa. This is a woman, Igbomina woman, in her dye pots in Nigeria. Again, these textiles, these indigo dyed textiles, are also associated with this important trade, and they continue to have this significance across the diaspora. It's important to understand that these textiles, again, also have importance amongst Afro-diasporic communities, such as this woman in Bahia who's wearing a textile woven in Nigeria, just like these Olowu-Dudu textiles that are woven in Ekiti and Owo. I also want to use this time, and I want to end this slide by talking about the fact that, again, Black artists are continuing to find ways in which they can reclaim these traditions. I want to spotlight two artists, Ife Franklin, who is from Boston. This is part of an installation, the Indigo Slave Cabin, that was in Franklin Park, in my hometown, where she was paying homage to those complex histories. And Ariane King Comer, who also studied at the Nikkei Center for Art and Culture, who works as an artist in South Carolina, also working with communities to reclaim indigo as a dye associated with African creativity and knowledge. Thank you. I think I went over.
We have time for some questions. If you'd like to just unmute the microphone and go ahead. I'll let you field questions.
Okay.
Please.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. Thank you first, Stephen, for that wonderful presentation. As you were describing these, no pun intended, various threads of textile kind of history and significance, I'm interested and curious about what happens in the sort of mixed media. So when you're using these different materials together, they clearly have their own kind of histories and significance, but is something different signified by the way that these materials are combined to a different effect or for different purposes in production?
So yeah, it very much depends on the piece. So for example, in this piece here, these pieces here that are dyed with indigo, I was using specific techniques, adire, and I was using specific materials because that relates to the subject matter. So the images that you're seeing here are images of female title holders. So, and they're also making direct references to historical figures as well. So you can see the Ogboni elder here, who's carrying a sword associated with the Ogboni Elder Society. This is a reference to a manifestation of Oshun, who is also associated with indigo dyeing. This is Oshun Yemese, who's a warrior woman associated with the town of Ido-Oshun. And this is an image of an Ialaro, so a mother of the dye pot. So the material that I'm using, the adire that's done on the cotton, muslin, and hand-woven textiles directly relates to the subject matter. So like thinking about like this textile as an art piece, but also the painting as reinforcing that. So what I'm using the material, what's very important to me is sort of thinking about the woven object as a fundamental part of the artwork. So it's not necessarily simply the surface that I'm working on, but an integral part of the work. So every part of it is meant to function that way. And it's the same with this textile here that has the raffia on the bottom. So like, this is my own work, and I didn't do this. This is supposed to be this. So the Sowoi wears a costume of black raffia. So the masked spirit that's associated with Sunday wears black raffia on their body. So that's a direct reference to the Sowoi, the spirit mask associated with the Sunday Women's Society. And the cloth that's using indigo and kola nut is directly related to the tradition of using kola and indigo amongst Mende-speaking women in Sierra Leone and Liberia. The same with the wooden objects that are carved on the side. Those black wooden objects that are carved with like these braids are reference to the hairstyle of the not only the Nyaha. The Nyaha is the initiate who emerges, from the bush, from the space of initiation. And the mask is representing the beauty, that idealized beauty. So that those braids are representing that hairstyle. So the painting itself is reinforcing the elements of the material that I'm using. So that's the point of that, if that makes sense. Oh.
Thanks a lot for your work, Stephen, right here.
Oh.
I was just curious if you could speak a bit of the gender dimensions of these ritual and aesthetic technologies a bit more. And also a question about the art of knowledge transmission and how these practices are indeed passed on, and how your own creative practice is part of this transmissive type of work or labor.
Okay, no problem. So indigo has different gendered significances depending on where you are on the continent. So indigo amongst groups living in the Windward Coast, Senegambia, and Nigeria is very much associated with the work of women, especially menopausal and postmenopausal women. And its association with, that woman's association with indigo has a lot of, it has a lot of significance in how those women move through that society. Those women are oftentimes associated with wealth and commerce because the indigo dyers it earns one a lot of income. And because of that, that's reverberated in the spiritual practices as well. So Yamakbo, who's the goddess of the indigo, of indigo dyeing, women's weaving, palm oil pressing, soap making, is a deity that's deeply associated with women's agency and industry. The same with Auchon, who's associated with wealth and fertility, is also an indigo dyer. So the gender dimension also is tied to power, it's tied to wealth, and it also can be tied to the medicinal practices as well. Indigo is used to shrink fibroids. It's added to the olele beans cake to shrink fibroids. Its smell is also associated, its use in the cloth is also associated with fertility. And it also is showing like women's agency over those powers. There are instances in which men yield indigo, specifically for sacrament purposes. There are also other secret practices which are used by both male and female specialists, babalawo, yanifa, to use indigo, but its association with womanhood and women's craft industries reverberate in different ways throughout the culture. With cotton and weaving, cotton spinning in most of Africa is done by women. This is not universal across the continent. And also cotton cultivation in many parts of Africa, specifically amongst Igbo people, is also a women's crop. Even though amongst Igbo, Yoruba, other groups in Nigeria, men tend to take the dominant role in terms of crop production. But even in areas where men are the weavers, such as in narrow strip or treadle loom weaving traditions, women tend to be the spinners. And the importance of cotton in relationship to the spinning and the production of thread is also considered a manifestation of women's industry. There's even been a lot of really amazing research talking about how the owner of cloth that's woven by women, in certain instances, because the yarn is spun by women, it belongs to the women. This is not amongst the Yoruba, this is amongst other groups. But that gender dimension is like very important in terms of like the production of the textiles, and it's also fed into the different elements of the culture. So like thinking about medicine cloth and its ability to regulate fertility has to do with the fact that cloth is absorbent. And because it's absorbent, it's associated with womanhood and feminine power because it's associated with absorbing power or containing power. So the cloth is analogized with the womb, the ability to absorb the powers of conception and fertility. And again, that relationship with the cotton root, which regulates that, is also something which I need to explore more, but also something that's incredibly powerful and important to think about.
Thank you, Stephen.
Can I just ask?
Yes,
I know
go
somebody
ahead,
had their
please.
hand up. I'm sorry. I know you got the shirt on. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very much interested in, and perhaps my inquiry right now is related to the question before. I'm becoming more ecologically minded and considering how older traditions, you know, like the things that mama and grandma do and did, how can we use them going forward? So as I'm listening to you, I'm deeply concerned about, I am not male bashing. I do believe that there's like you know, we talk about patriarchy, so there's this strong masculine energy that's happening, and I'm considering our ability to nurture the earth. How are you as an artist considering this? I'm also an artist, and I try to use my art to address current issues. How are you considering the power of indigo and the power of the feminine energy about it? How are you seeing this in terms of addressing our current issues that are specifically related to use of energy in the way that we do not nurture the planet, and the way that we are not caring for the future and you know, with facing environmental concerns. So how are you thinking of being intentional about using art in that way specifically, or any suggestions?
So one of the things that I think about that a lot in my work, specifically in how the work is produced. I no longer use chemical dyes in the work, but I'm also thinking about that in terms of my relationship with clothing and cloth in general. So one of the things about indigo dyeing and about cloth production in this specific context is even though cloth was produced at a fairly large scale, cloth was not consumed in the same way. So one of the things that I'm thinking about is like the idea of like consumption. So the thing about cloth as it's produced in this way is that it's not something that's thrown away. It's something, cloth does not die, only wears to shreds. That's a Yoruba proverb. It talks about the use of cloth over time. So it's talking about like our relationship with clothing as not something that we buy and discard, but something that stays with us for a while. So when I'm thinking about like how we're rethinking that in terms of creating material culture that we use, one of the things that I really think about is like, what does it look like for us as consumers of handmade textiles? How do we think about that and changing our relationship with textiles in general as not things that are single use, not things that end up in landfill, but things that become incorporated into the culture in a way where we're rethinking the way that we're consuming clothing, which is one of the things I think about as a teacher. I've been trying to teach traditional weaving and dyeing to Black communities, specifically young people. I'm really thinking about ways in which we can sort of rethink all of that. I'm still figuring it out, and I'm still trying to figure out ways in which it can be something that's like, that becomes part of like that becomes embedded in a culture that way, where it causes us to rethink that. But I think that there's a lot of people who are doing that work. Eugenia Alexander, who has an indigo dye farm St. Louis. There's a lot of black women especially who are doing a lot of work with indigo, a lot of work with sustainability and dyeing, a lot of work like rethinking like consumption and how we relate to clothing and the making of clothing and art, also related to food justice. So there's a lot of different artists who are doing that work. That's what I'm thinking about in my work. But again, like all of us, there's still so much more to be done.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Our third presenter, Dr. Marcela Perdomo, is currently a visiting lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. From 2019 to 2021, she was a Dietrich School Diversity Postdoctoral Fellow in the same department. In 2019, she received her PhD in Ethnology and Social Anthropology from the School of Higher Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. During her doctoral training, she received 2 grants for conducting fieldwork from the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale and from the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique in Paris. Her current research interests include the anthropology of African diaspora societies, anthropology of Afro-Atlantic religions, medical and cultural anthropology, theory of race, historical consciousness, power and inequality, and ethnographic reflexivity. The title of Dr. Perdomo's paper is Repairing the Past Through Spirit Possession Among the Garifuna of Honduras.
Greetings and good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored to be here present today to talk about my paper entitled Repairing the Past Through Spirit Possession Among the Garifuna of Honduras. But before I begin, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. And I would also like to thank the organizers of today's gathering for their inspiring selection of the theme, the Africana Sacred Healing Arts. So thank you very much. So in today's talk, I want to explore the impressive link between spirit possession, subjective experience, collective trauma, religion, healing, and ethnic pride among Garifuna mediums who incarnate the spirit of the ancestors. Now, my reflections today are on a more theoretical part of my work, though they are, of course, ethnographically informed. And so by focusing on recurrent patterns of possession and several initiation rites, my paper explores how intriguing fragments of a collective past trauma is heavily embodied by individuals. So I must say here that in comparison with other people of African descent in the Americas, the Garifuna's broad trajectory has taken unexpected shifts since their emergence as a distinct group within the enslaved Caribbean. Their mass deportation to the north coast of Central America by the British Crown at the end of the 18th century became a major turning point for this Afro-Amerindian group. So during possession scenes, the spirits of the dead broadcast stories that intermingle allusions to the group's historical trauma of land dispossession and exile with recriminations to ungrateful kin that have neglected their remembrance. So my work shows how the loss of equilibrium caused by the tormented revenants may be reestablished through religious devotion, prioritizing deep down inside the symbolical reparation of a dark past. So I met Basilia in the summer of 2010 while conducting fieldwork on spirit possession in the Garifuna village of Triunfo de la Cruz, located in northern Honduras. And at that time, Basilia was a robust, elegant, outgoing, 50-year-old woman who was an influential priestess within her religious community. But to hear her tell it, she was like many young, non-initiated Garifuna, ferociously opposed to Dugu, the traditional religion of the Garifuna. And I asked Basilia how she came to be a medium, and she was very matter of fact. She said, I came to Dugu because the old ones forced me, she claimed. And the old ones she was referring to happened to be the spirits of the dead. Now, as a young woman in the 1990s, Basilia was a skeptical and enthusiastic nurse living at the heart of the Bronx. She bore 5 children and lived the life of a successful young professional mother until the day she turned 33. Little did she know that on that special day, she would experience her first spirit possession. And in an interview, Basilia elaborates her first encounter with the spirits. And she says, when I was little, my mother had already taken me to see my grandfather, who was a spirit medium. And he told her I had some spirits that would look for me one day. The day of my 33rd birthday, the spirits appeared. Right when I was about to eat, I sat down and saw them entering through the main entrance. Suddenly, the spirits caught me, meaning they possessed her. They spoke through me, but I don't remember anything. So her dreams the next days were also related to her trance-like state. In them, her ancestors were pressuring her to accept initiation to become a Dugu priestess, or else they would tie her to a tree trunk and set her on fire. Now, it is not surprising that spiritual calls from the ancestors are rarely embraced by the chosen individuals. To the contrary, future initiates regularly experience liminal attitudes of resistance, skepticism, and aversion. Yet, in many cases, not attending the call of the ancestors can be life-threatening. For instance, Francisca learned of her destiny to worship the ancestors through revelatory illness while she was in her early 30s. As she suffered from chronic high fever and mysterious abdominal pain, divination revealed that her dead kin required her to begin initiation urgently, or else she would die. So in addition to physical illness and recurrent dreaming with the dead, there's a trigger that seems to awaken the ancestor's vengeful spirit: immoral conduct. So before entering apprenticeship as a Dugu priest, Isani, a 17-year-old teenage boy, frequently smoked marijuana and was accused of physical violence by his peers. So possessed by the spirit of his dead grandfather, the young priest would exhibit shameful public comportment, such as throwing himself into a trash bin on more than one occasion. These spirits' attack or spiritual punishments, castigos in Spanish, as my interlocutors call them, are usually interpreted as an urgency to appease the ancestors through initiation and devotion. So the question is, why are the Garifuna people getting possessed by their deceased relatives? What do they want from the living? And so to answer this question, we must explore the singular ethnogenesis and history of the Garifuna people, because it's a historical thing. So here, you see the map of St. Vincent Island right there, right at the bottom. So during the last half of the 17th century, enslaved Africans destined for Caribbean labor were abruptly thrown onto the shores of the small free island of St. Vincent, provoking a sudden encounter with the indigenous people, the Carib Indians. And out of this unexpected co-presence, an atypical Caribbean society was born. Until today, however, the paradigmatic interracial relationship between Africans and island Caribs remains something of a mystery. And in this slide, you can see the paintings of Agostino Brunias, an Italian artist that lived in the Caribbean in the 18th century. And you can see the first painting depicts the Carib Indians right here. And the second painting depicts the first Garifuna people, so the mixture of the autochthonous people and the Africans. So in 1797, after nearly a century of Garifuna sovereignty over St. Vincent and many, many wars against the British, the Garifuna people were forced to leave en masse by the British crown. In fact, here you can see also, you can observe another painting by Brunias, and the scene depicts negotiation between the early Garifuna and the British colonialists. So the Garifuna were exiled to Roatan Island, an ex-British colony located on the Atlantic coast of Honduras. And this traumatic displacement was a major turning point in Garifuna history, to the point where the loss of the Isle of St. Vincent remains entrenched in Dugu, the traditional religion, and emerges among individuals' psychosomatic experiences and ritual performance. So here, I refer to spirit possession exclusively from the indigenous perspective. Owehani is the vernacular term used by my local interlocutors to describe the introduction of a spirit ancestor into the body of a human being. It is a pronominal verb derived from the word owini, which means death in Garifuna. So you can see here that it seems rather clear that the link between possession and the spirit of the dead is unequivocal in Dugu. So during the phase of the spiritual call, most candidates report dealing with angry and vindictive spirits, scenes of life or death situations, food petitions, recriminations of abandonment, persecution, and physical aggression constitute the leitmotifs during dreams and trance-like states. And the scenery is also very suggestive of the traumatic event of displacement from St. Vincent endured by the Garifuna. Rendered homeless by the British, ancestors appear in dreams laying on tropical seashores, suffering from great fatigue and extending empty cups and plates to the dreamers. So the Garifuna ancestors ask for ritual. They want to hear the vibrant sound of the drums. They crave the sight of symbols and gestures, the intense taste of rum and the scent of breath and cigar smoke. They also crave food, especially traditional food. In fact, it is important here to stress that the request for Garifuna traditional dishes and drinks is a frequent common denominator within the entranced people's allocution. In fact, their craving is so strong that while conducting fieldwork, I witnessed a case of a young woman in her early 20s who was being nightly possessed by the spirit of her deceased uncle, only to require a plate of hudutu, a traditional coconut-based dish with seafood, highly appreciated by the Garifuna. So in that case, a religious authority can conclude via divination that the source of the annoyance lies in a bad relationship with the spirits of the dead, and that they are now calling for appeasement and devotion. From another perspective, it is safe to say that dead spirits are the instigators of misfortune and the cure of this misfortune all at the same time. Very typical in spirit possession. Very well, so now I'm going to expose some of the healing methods proposed by the Garifuna Dugu. So first of all, about the Garifuna Dugu. So Dugu is an initiatory possession-based religion, even though the religion's origin derived from a confluence of Amerindian shamanism, African and Roman Catholic antecedents. Garifuna's spiritual beliefs and liturgical tapestry are clearly situated among the West African derived religions. However, unlike the majority of the Afro-Atlantic religions like Haitian Voodoo, Cuban Santeria, or Brazilian Candomblé, the African deities, for example, the Orishas, do not make part of the cosmological structure here. Instead, the Garifuna worship ancestor spirits called Gubida. Now, the religious community is formed around a ritual leader, medium and traditional healer named Buye. Nevertheless, in order to attain this status, worshippers must undergo through an engaging initiation process. And one of them involves learning the mastery of possession trance states through a series of bodily treatments. So again, the cure of possession illness is more possession, so ritual possession now. So according to British anthropologist Alfred Gell's study about the abductive social agency of our objects, certain artifacts, he says, do not represent a corresponding body of social cultural knowledge. Rather, the very materiality of the object itself is, the object is itself a vehicle of such knowledge. So following Gell's theoretical approach, I shall suggest that the costume for initiation to Dugu affords the initiate with a prolongation of the human body, which enables the new medium to attain different states of dissociation or trance, if you will, through ontological transformation. So, apparaling the initiate in the galatu, which means the initiate's traditional costume, is a preliminary ritual sequence characterized by its power to invoke the spirits of the dead and thus to induce the first-like trance states. The novice's ritual costume is made out of local traditional textile known by the Spanish name of manta, as you can see it here. After the artisanal creation of the ritual costume, it is dyed with red annatto seeds, also dingo, making allusion to the last presentation about indigo. The Garifuna also use it, and it's called in Garifuna dingo. So it's also used for inducing spirit possession this time. But it is, the costume itself is dyed with red annatto seeds, known as achiote in Spanish or gusewe in Garifuna. And the use of the red seeds is reminiscent of the Arawakan or Amerindian body ornament from South America and the Caribbean. In this specific case, the substance more precisely calls to mind the Garifuna's Amerindian ancestors, the island Carib Indians from St. Vincent. In fact, during colonial times, the Europeans adopted the descriptor red Caribs, given that their skin was usually covered by this natural dye. The Garifuna, as you can see it here, continue to make use of this substance, but only for spiritual purposes. Now, the aim of dyeing the ceremonial costume is to create a direct contact with the dead. It is believed that the mere fact of wearing the costume contributes to induce spiritual possession due to its specific powerful agency. But in order to obtain this agency, specialists must engage in a vigorous ritual procedure to animate the costume. So aside of that, they use also other specific substances that will ultimately give it la fuerza, or the spiritual force, and other high esoteric connotations. So many interviewees report feeling strange sensations just by physically approaching their new costumes. For example, dizziness, mild hallucination, mental alienation, and intense heat are some of the symptoms experienced once they come in contact with the special outfit. And these are also known as preliminary symptoms of spirit possession. So I have to hurry here a little. Yes, okay. So very rapidly, the other ritual I wanted to talk about is called Become Invisible to the spirits and making the spirits visible. This is done through arani, which is a medicinal cleansing, and its scope is actually to provoke high somnolence in the initiates, who will then which will then provoke a very intense state of dreaming, where they will be able to visualize the spirits that are possessing them. And to the contrary, the arani, the medicinal cleansing, will clean the individual of mundane contact, and so that the spirits can see their mount. And finally, as you can see here, the expulsion from the native land and the loss of sovereignty over the island remains forever engaged and engraved in the ritual corpus. So there's a pilgrimage to the seashore, is the ritual concluding fragment that reproduces highly symbolic scenes of the group's historical arrival to Central America. And so wearing already the costumes, here you will see people falling into cathartic trances, and these bouts of possession may bring a measure of chaos, since they manifest collectively in a domino effect by a form of contagion. So this is very cathartic for the Garifuna collective trauma. And so to conclude this presentation, I would like to say that healing is at the heart of the religions that African slaves bequeathed to their descendants, and Dugu practice is no exception. Concepts, and again, concepts of healing and spirituality are crucial to promoting agency and empowerment for people of African descent, especially in their diasporic displacement from Africa to the Americas, and in this particular case, from St. Vincent to Central America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcela. We have time for one question. Sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'll try not to take too much time. This was an incredible presentation. I'm really curious about the use of achote, especially how it facilitates initiation. Are there any other ritual or medicinal uses for achote? Medicinal uses, and have you done research on the use of achote in ritual situations amongst other Arawak-speaking peoples?
Among the Garifuna, the achiote is usually used for spiritual purposes. It is also used in cuisine in Latin America in general, not really to give it taste, but color. In the Garifuna and among the Amerindian people, achiote has a high spiritual significance. And in the case of the Garifuna, as I said, it is mainly used to induce spirit possession. It's one of the ingredients that contributes to induce trance among the people. So it's very taboo. It's very, you don't mess with the chiote like that. So yes, it has a very sacred status.
Thank you, Marcela. I'd like to conclude now with inviting everyone for a round of applause to our presenters as we break.
Thank you.
Thank you all.